This is a recent headline, not too recent, 1989, June the 30th, 1989. Power broker served drugs, sex at parties, bugged for blackmail. Here's another headline. Homosexual prostitution probe ensnarls the fissures of the Bush and Reagan administration. Top Japanese politician linked to Spence. Craig Spence was a CIA operative. He was exposed as a CIA operative. His job was to set up dignitaries, politicians, congressmen, etc., and to blackmail them. Once he was exposed, of course, he didn't last too long. He lasted something like 6 months. Within 6 months, I think he was suicided. Now, recently, it's sometimes referred to as Arkancided, by the way. Not Spence, though. This was before Mr. Bill Clinton was in the White House. But in my experience as a private investigator, security consultant over the last 17 years, I've had a number of high-profile cases in addition to the Jeffrey McDonald case. And I'm happy to report I've had a phenomenal success record on it. It takes a lot of time, a lot of diligence, and the right contacts in order to be successful in this field. But in 1989, I was contacted by a gentleman by the name of Ed Weaver, a wonderful Christian man in Lincoln, Nebraska. And he had read about me in a book called The Ultimate Evil by Maury Terry. The Ultimate Evil was a story about the Son of Sam murders in New York. But as a result of my name appearing in the book The Ultimate Evil, Ed called me and said, you know, are you the same Ted Gunderson that went to Lincoln High School in Lincoln, Nebraska, and went to the University of Nebraska? And I said, I am. He said, well, I'm Ed Weaver, and I was your classmate, and of course I remembered him. But he said, we have a real problem here in Nebraska. We have a case called the Franklin Cover-Up, and in this particular case, the F.B.I. and the IRS raided the Franklin Credit Bureau, which was a credit bureau established in the minority neighborhood in order to furnish banking and financial opportunities to the minorities. People on the board of directors included people like Harold Anderson, who was past publisher of the Omaha World Herald, other very prominent citizens. And as a result of the raid, there was publicity. Larry King, by the way, was the individual who was president of the Savings and Loan. Not Larry King, live CNN, but Larry King, a black man, a fast-rising star in the Republican Party, had sung the national anthem in Texas at the Republican National Convention and New Orleans at the Republican National Convention. As a result of the publicity, there were 80 children in Omaha came forward and talked about being exposed and ritualistically and sexually victims of this element, this group of people. These were some of the leading businessmen in Omaha. These kids named not only Harold Anderson, but they also named Bob Wadman, chief of police, as being involved in this ring. They named Gene Mahoney, past former vice squad with the Omaha, vice detective with the Omaha Vice Squad, Omaha, Nebraska, and he's now head of the Forestry Service for the state, has a park named after him between Lincoln and Omaha. They named the editor of the society page of the Omaha World Herald. They named the heir to the Brandeis fortune. I mean, these were top citizens, highly respected people in the community. And of these 80 children that came forward, 4 of them gave statements. Of the 4 who gave statements, 2 of them later recanted, probably under pressure. 2 refused to recant, Alicia Owens and Paul Benassi. And actually, what happened with Paul, they feel like they apparently discredited him because he had been convicted of child molestation. Alicia Owens claimed that she had sex with Bob Wadman, chief of police, when she was 14 years old. She told the grand jury that. And as a result, they tried her for perjury before the grand jury, and she was convicted. As far as I'm concerned, I attended the trial, a day of the trial, and it was a kangaroo court. There's no question in my mind. But this was the situation, and in discussing the matter, I did go back to Nebraska, of course, after talking to Ed, and I'm telling you right now about my experience there in talking to Paul and Alicia and so forth. But in talking to Paul, he gave me a number of signed statements. By the way, Gary Caradori, the investigator before me, died in an airplane crash coming out of Chicago. He had called they had a state Senate committee that was organized for the purpose of checking into this situation, this child sexual ring. And he had called the Senator, Lawrence Schmidt from Chicago. He was sent back there on a lead. Called Senator Schmidt, and said, I have the goods right now. They cannot get out of it. He got on an airplane that night, and the plane crashed outside of Chicago, about an hour and a half out of Chicago. And his briefcase is missing, and the back seat of the plane is missing. They claim that he had engine trouble and the plane disintegrated, but there was a farmer who saw a flash of fire and light, and he felt that it was very obvious to me and obvious to anybody else that there was probably a bomb in the plane. I can't prove it. This is what is being spread and thought about at the present time, and has been for some time. But anyway, Gary Caradori had done a great job on the case. I was not replacing him in full because I couldn't work full-time on it. I had a business in California. But in talking to Paul Benassi, he told me about the number of times when he and others were taken out of schools, private schools in Omaha, driven by limousine to Sioux City, Iowa, and placed on private jets and flown to Washington, D.C. for sex orgy parties with congressmen and senators. Paul told me, and has drawn for me, the living quarters of the White House. The public's not allowed in the living quarters of the White House. There's no question in my mind Paul is telling the truth. But in addition to this, he talked about an organized child kidnapping ring, which I will discuss later on in the lecture. We'll discuss that in the second half, by the way. But this is your documentation. This is what I'm saying. And by the way, Paul knew Craig Spence, knew him very closely, and had worked with Craig in setting some of these politicians up. Now, stop and think about this. There's an extensive amount of corruption in the state of Nebraska. There's no question about it. My sources in Montana tell me that there's an extensive amount of drugs and corruption with officials in that state. It makes a lot of sense, and it's much easier to corrupt a state with a few small population rather than with a large population like New York and California. So I think that's what we're looking at, and that would also include, of course, Arkansas. Now, I have, in my experience in developing information about satanic movement in this country, I've talked to a lot of people. An example of this, number 12, being born bred. I was contacted by a lady attorney in New York City. She was a multi-generation Satanist. You remember I told you that's somebody that's been raised, born into the family. Grandfather, grandmother, mother, father, etc. She told me that she was raised by her family. She knew well in advance that she was going to be an attorney, and she was sent to law school, and her specialty was immigration laws. And she would go to Europe and bring children into this country that she didn't know, land at Kennedy Airport in New York City, turn these children over, usually one child at a time, and she was a specialist on immigration, so she knew what to do in Europe in order to get their hands on this child, bring the child in, turn it over to a man, two men, in Kennedy Airport she'd never met before, and walk away. She was supposedly bringing the child in for adoption. I've seen case after case of history where people were specifically assigned and born and reared and trained for assignments in this area. Have you ever heard of presidential models? Presidential models are sex slaves for some of the top people in the government. There's a woman named Kathy O'Brien who's recently written a book on this. I happen to know of another lady who was a presidential model. And what they do, and these ladies were born for that purpose. In fact, one of them was born on Eisenhower's inauguration. And they're trained mind control, MK Ultra, Project Monarch. These are C.I.A. mind control programs. They're trained specifically for an assignment. In this particular assignment, she told me, the one lady told me that she was molested on a regular basis by her father, and he still loved her, however, And when she was 16, he came in and he was crying in her bedroom. He said, "My dear, I've got to give you up." And he passed her on to some training for training with a group of men. She later ended up with some of the top politicians in the country, presidents. I'm talking about presidents. This has been confirmed by two individuals I've talked to, Kathy O'Brien and another one. The other one wishes to remain anonymous. And I understand there are 3 other ladies who fall in this category. They've all gotten out. And it's just like the children that they use for victims of pedophile. When they get so old, they let them out, push them out into the street. And as far as I'm concerned, there's not a dime's worth of difference between the Democrats or the Republicans. They've both been compromised. And these kids that were taken back to Washington, D.C., they weren't taken back just for Democrats, and they weren't taken back just for Republicans. There were Republicans and Democrats there. By the way, in the Nebraska case, this is a typical example of controlling the press. Yorkshire Television out of England came into Lincoln and Omaha and did a 10-month TV documentary of the case. They talked to Paul Bonacci, Alicia Owens, and by the way, the kids told me that there were victims, young children were being transported from Omaha to Des Moines, to Milwaukee, to Madison, back to Minneapolis. They were being victimized by some of the leading men in all of these various communities, leading businessmen. But Yorkshire Television came in. We couldn't, John could not get an American organization or corporation or American studio or film production company to do anything here, so he went to England. They worked for 10 months. They put together a TV documentary. It's called Conspiracy in Silence. On May the 4th, 1994, it was to be aired. 2 weeks before it was to be aired, on the Discovery Channel was purchased by Cox Television, and the show was killed. Cox Television out of Atlanta, Georgia. One of the major stockholders in Cox Television, according to John DeCamp, is George Bush. I find that very interesting.